Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. Can I get everybody's attention? Okay. Welcome to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. My name is Adil Iskander. I'm an adjunct professor here and I teach media and communications classes. It's a pleasure to be introducing today's program. The title for today's panel is Looking Ahead for the Palestinians After the UN Vote. Of course, an incredibly timely topic that is up for discussion, and we have two phenomenal panelists to be discussing this today. The first panelist is Dr. Salim Tamari. He's a visiting professor here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies and the director of the IPS-affiliated Institute of Jerusalem Studies. He's the editor of Jerusalem Quarterly and Hawliyat al-Quds. He is a professor of sociology at Birzeit University and has co-authored several works on urban culture, political sociology, biography, and social history, and the social history of the Eastern Mediterranean. Our second panelist is Helena Cobban. She's a British-American writer and researcher on international relations with special interests in the Middle East, the international system, and transitional justice. In March 2010, she founded a new book publishing company called the Just World Publishing. She received her BA and master's degrees from Oxford University, and from 1974 until 1981, she worked as a Beirut-based correspondent for various news outlets, including the Christian Science Monitor, the Sunday Times, ABC News, and BBC. In 1982, she moved to the United States to take up a research fellowship at Harvard University Center for International Affairs. She has since then published 6 additional books, 3 others on questions of the Middle East war and peace, 3 on international issues. She's a contributing editor at the Boston Review, where she has published essays on Palestinian-Israeli issues, Iraq, and post-conflict justice. She contributes a weekly news analysis on Middle East developments to Interpress Service and makes periodic contributions to foreignpolicy.com, as well as the Christian Science Monitor. So we have a star-studded panel. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Helena Cobban. Oh, last word? Okay. Are you okay? Okay. All right, fantastic. And once both speakers have offered the remarks, which we will limit to 15 minutes, Dr. Tamari will take over as moderator of the session during the question-answer period. So without further ado.
Thanks for that nice introduction and for holding this discussion, which, as Adil noted, is incredibly timely. The PLO's statehood bid marks the beginning of the end of a long period in Palestinian political history in which the Fatah leadership of the PLO had tied its fate to the success of US diplomacy. I remember I interviewed Abu Mazen in Tunis must have been 1987, and he laid it out the whole theory then, which in his view was that you need to hug the Israelis so close and show them so much love that they would have no alternative but to be generous and reciprocate the love. And I think now, however many years we are later, 14, 24, I don't know. It's quite clear that 24, is it? Anyway, never mind. That whole strategy, which relied on having a strong relationship with the United States as well as Israel, has led to a complete dead end. In fact, the period of tying the fate of the PLO to US diplomacy goes back to the 1974 PNC decision taken in Algiers to pursue a two-state solution using primarily diplomatic means, and within that, using primarily the diplomatic power of the United States. So now we are moving to a time when either the US will no longer be in a dominant blocking position in the international community, or Fatah will no longer be in a dominant blocking position in the Palestinian leadership, or the two-state solution will be off the international agenda, or quite possibly all three of these things. We're in a very dynamic situation right now. The whole of the Arab regional system has been essentially blocked and ossified since 1970. If you look what happened in 1970 throughout the region, there were many developments that kind of gelled into place a system that lasted until January of this year. You know, whether you're talking Tunis or Libya or Jordan or, you know, throughout the whole region, 1970 was really the time that that situation, first of all, gelled into position, then became politically very ossified. I've tried to think, and it's important to be able to do this, why Abu Mazen made this kind of last-ditch Hail Mary pass of trying to take the Palestinian issue to the UN. And I think he probably felt that he had no alternative but to do so. His political position was eroding very, very strongly, especially in recent years, but I would say especially since the publication of the Palestine Papers in January and then the fall of Mubarak in February. Mubarak really was the sword and shield for the whole US-Israeli project in the region, of which he up until then had bought into and was reliant on. And so with the fall of Mubarak, his position became much more exposed and weak. And just as we saw Abu Ammar Yasser Arafat rushing to Oslo in 1983 as a sort of a Hail Mary pass when his political position within the Palestinian movement was extremely weak. It was only Oslo that saved him from complete political humiliation in 1983. I think the same is true for Abu Mazen today. But having launched this UN project, I think he may well end up having to take position. It may pull him further along than he would have chosen to go. It started a kind of momentum that he may not be in control of, and you see new forces arising within Fatah. Although Saeb Erekat has this amazing capability to come back, even though I thought he had resigned back in February or whenever, but there he is. But, you know, you do see some new forces coming up with interesting new positions. I'm just giving you really some kind of quick notes. I got in from a conference in Algiers just last night, so I'm a little bit jet-lagged, but I think they hang together. So you have Abu Mazen taking this step that he probably wouldn't have chosen to take if he hadn't felt so isolated and weak in other respects. And meantime, we have decisions being made in DC that are completely illogical by our government here, and that seem to be dragging the US into a far steeper and speedier decline in power and influence in the Middle East and worldwide than would otherwise have occurred. I don't know if you recall in The Economist in the summer when there were the budget discussions, there was a wonderful little cartoon where you had sort of the Tea Party leading the GOP by the nose, and the GOP was pulling Congress by the nose, and Congress was pulling the whole of the US government by the nose, and the US government was pulling the world economy, toward a precipice. And I think you could do a very similar kind of one nowadays with Mort Klein of the Zionist Organization of America pulling the rest of the Zionist lobby by the nose, pulling the whole of the US Congress by the nose, pulling the US government by the nose toward a precipice. But, that's how the system works here. That's the role of lobbies and the really disgraceful role of money in politics in this country. Well, we could ask how we have reached this situation, and I think we should have some good discussions after Salim has spoken. I just want to make a few notes. I kind of wish I had a blackboard, but anyway. First one is on the parallelism between the trajectories of Fatah and Hamas. Fatah in 1974, as I mentioned earlier, took a kind of a strategic decision at a PNC in Algiers to opt for the two-state solution. Hamas did the same in 2005 when they decided to participate in the PA elections of 2006. Remember that they had not participated in the PA elections of 1996 because they thought the whole PA project was fraudulent. But in 2005 they finally bought into it. Probably too late. I mean, I don't think they are any more likely to get a two-state solution than Fatah is. However, if there is to be recognition of any Palestinian state, one interesting paradox is that Hamas is in a far better position to claim it for the administration they're running in Gaza, as per the conditions of the Montevideo Convention on what constitutes a state that should be recognized. Because they do control territory and population and borders. My passport has 3 or 4 border stamps issued by the PA in Rafah. And, I may be one of the few Americans to be able to claim that. You never get a border stamp when you go across Allenby Bridge, because the borders there are controlled by the Israelis. And there are many other ways in which Hamas has been running what looks much more like a state than anything Fatah has been running in the West Bank. I don't know if you read The Economist this week, has a good little piece on this. There was a World Bank report back in, I think, August or June, noting the effectiveness of Hamas's economic policy and the fact that Gaza, from a very, very low baseline, has experienced 28% growth in 2010, whereas the much lauded growth in the West Bank that everybody says, gee, look at Salam Fayyad, it was 7% or something, again from a pretty low base. But and then if you haven't read it, you should all read Yazid Sayeg's excellent comparison of the two administrations in Gaza and the West Bank that was published by Brandeis earlier this year, was it, or last year, in which he looked at many indicators of the quality of governance, including good governance, things like transparency and accountability, and noted that the Hamas administration has done remarkably well on very, very small resources, including running good public information through their PA websites, and delivering security in Gaza at a much, much lower cost per head of population than the so-called security that's delivered in the West Bank, which doesn't give the residents any security whatsoever from the incursions of the IDF or the settlers, and at a huge cost. And as Yazid noted, when you go around the West Bank, you see a lot of armed men standing around. When I was in Gaza in June, it's really stunning how you don't see armed people. There are police, and maybe some of them have side weapons, but the only armed people we saw were just sitting at the end of the little alley in Shete refugee camp where Ismail Haniyeh's home is. But the rest of Gaza is functioning souks and a lot of construction, things going on, with decent public security people, feeling free to come and go in a way that they never could in Gaza when Fatah was in control prior to 2006. So anyway, that's just a kind of a little paradox, that if there is to be a state and people take the recognized indices of what constitutes, a state, then it looks much more likely to be in Gaza than in the West Bank. However, nobody in Hamas or anywhere else in the Palestinian community is going to be satisfied with what would be like a Gaza-only solution. That has always been quite clearly quite unacceptable to all Palestinians. And if you need to look at the Thawabit, Thawra al-Falastiniya, as listed by Hamas or people in Fatah. And at the top of the Thawabit, I would say, is always Jerusalem, which is a central issue for all the Palestinians, whether they're in Gaza, in Jerusalem itself, inside Israel, in other areas of the West Bank, or in exile. Jerusalem is actually potentially a very interesting issue. It's sort of the pivot between a two-state solution and a one-state solution, because the recent Israeli governments, by enlarging Jerusalem so much and then pouring so much concrete into the fortress-like settlements in whole areas of what used to be just the West Bank, but claiming that they are now Jerusalem, has essentially made a two-state solution impossible because of their focus on enlarging and settling Jerusalem, which cuts right, I mean, it goes into Ma'ali Adumim and cuts right across the West Bank. And, you know, they try, and every so often people in this peace processing industry make claims that you can kind of have tunnels or bridges or overpasses or whatever and link the different areas of the West Bank like, you know, to Rubik cubes or pieces of Swiss cheese. But it really, when you're there on the ground, as I'm sure many of you have been, it looks quite impossible as the basis for two states living side by side in peace. Jerusalem is also a pivot because it's the place where the concerns of the Palestinians of the occupied territories, remembering that there are however many 100,000 of Palestinians in occupied Jerusalem whose situation is extremely vulnerable, but it's the place where the concerns of the Palestinians of the occupied territories coincide and merge with the concerns of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Of course, the Palestinians of Jerusalem themselves are in a sort of limbo position. They don't get to vote in Israeli elections, but they are on the Israeli side of the wall. But the Palestinians citizens of Israel have shown over recent years remarkable adherence to the concept of Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital and remarkable organizing capability to actually, you know, send down, because of course none of them live in West Jerusalem. West Jerusalem is the most thoroughly ethnically cleansed of all the Israeli cities. But, you know, they send regular delegations from northern Israel and southern Israel and elsewhere to go and undertake solidarity actions in Jerusalem, which is really important. And so Jerusalem, from that sense, really brings together the concerns of Palestinians who are inside Israel as citizens and Palestinians of the occupied territories. I just want to finish with a couple of thoughts on how the Arab Spring has affected the Palestinian movement as a, let's say, global movement. First, I'll note the inspiration that many participants and leaders in the Arab Spring took from the first and even the early days of the second Intifada. You need to remember that the second Intifada, the first 2 months were largely non-violent civilian mass organizing. It was only after around 100 Palestinians had been shot dead by the IDF that the non-violent discipline broke down and the men of violence took over back then in 2000. So, you know, there has always been a very strong tradition of civilian mass organizing in the occupied territories, especially since 1982, since the time when the PLO was expelled from Beirut, and thus the Palestinians the occupied territories lost the last of the hopes that they had previously had that they could be saved from outside. First of all, their hope was that they could be saved by some combination of the Arab states, and that didn't work, including in 1973. And then they hoped they could be saved by the PLO, which was always a little bit of an iffy proposition, I think. But in 1982, it became definitively clear that they could not be saved from outside. They had to save themselves, and that's why, and I'm sure maybe Salim can say a lot more about that. Second, I want to note that the Arab Spring has not really occurred very much in any of the Arab countries or societies that have seen grave internal violence in the last 15 years. And this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently. For example, Iraq, Lebanon, and Algeria, all of which have seen grave internal violence in the last 15 years. None of them have seen a significant flowering of the Arab Spring. People in those countries, I mean, I'm just coming from Algeria, and I've obviously been quite a lot in Lebanon, haven't been in Iraq for ages. But people in Algeria seem like they had a few demonstrations, but then they backed off. I think they just felt that they didn't want to risk the whole thing erupting into civil conflict of the kind that, just brought the whole country to its knees for 10 years in the 1990s. And I'm sure in Iraq it's the same, and I know in Lebanon it's the same. And I think in Palestine, which sees not only the continuous violence of the occupation, but also saw the costs of the Fatah-Hamas civil strife. There's probably a reluctance amongst many people to let it go too far towards that, to let it get out of control. And there's also a phenomenon that, although in the West the Arab Spring is people like to present it as kind of a sort of spontaneous youth movement or whatever. That's not the case, actually, in the places where it's really succeeded. In Egypt and Tunisia, there are, long-standing civil society organizations that built the basis for what happened, and, people in there, I don't know, I'm nearly 60, so like everybody looks like a youth to me, but it's not, in most countries, people who are in their 30s would not be considered youths, and that's kind of the generation that is leading this thing. Anyway, just a lot of reasons that people in these strife-torn Arab countries seem to have backed away from full participation in the Arab Spring. Yemen is an exception, but Yemen has been an exception for a long time. Yemen is sort of, you can call it Saudi Arabia's Gaza. I mean, it's really a tragic place, where the Saudis have just pushed all the Yemenis who used to work in Saudi Arabia out as being the unwanted people, and then imported migrant short-term contract labor from Asia, just as the Israelis have done to the Palestinians. So in the Palestinian case, you did have these organizing efforts around the Nakba and the Naksa. They did a few things, but they looked a little derivative and a little sort of copycatish. I think they did succeed in kind of galvanizing the Fatah and Hamas leaderships into the reconciliation agreement of late April. In Lebanon, what happened with the mobilization for May 15th was really tragic. Because they took 50,000 Palestinians from the camps in Lebanon, and the camps in Lebanon are the worst Palestinian refugee camps anywhere. I mean, so the people live in the camps there. It's very risky for them to go out of the camps. They're not allowed to work outside of the camps. Sometimes they come and go, but there are so many people who hate them in Lebanon, and they can't work outside the camps, and the camps are so closed in. They're all far from the border, so the mobilization took them to like 500 meters from the border, and these kids, these people who had been dreaming of Palestine for all their lives, and they'd never been anywhere near the border, and Hezbollah has kept them away from the border for a long time, policing the border on their own behalf. So with a careful agreement with Hezbollah. They went to this place in Marun Ras, near the border, and then they could see Palestine. And many of them, it was just too much, and they poured down the hill, and through the Lebanese gendarmerie and the Hezbollah people who were supposed to stop them from getting to the border, and they just went down to the border and got slaughtered. I mean, it was just a terrible thing that happened. So anyway, there will no doubt be other mobilizations, but it will be different. That included, the grandson of Munib al-Masri was very badly hurt in that shooting, but I think about 11 or 15 Palestinians were just shot dead by the Israelis as they approached the border there. So there are problems with all these organizing efforts. Needs a lot of planning, needs a lot of coordination. Obviously, if you're a refugee, you need to coordinate with the people in the host government, the host society. You need to try and build a large civil movement. And it may happen over time. In fact, I think a lot of it is happening, although the Hamas-Fatah split has affected the Palestinians in Lebanon quite badly. But I think the biggest effect of the Arab Spring has not been the kind of the exemplary effect that some people predicted thus far. It's been the huge effect of the toppling of Mubarak and the transformation of Egyptian politics. It's really hard to overestimate the role that Mubarak and Jordan's King Abdullah play as the kind of the advance guard of protecting Israel's interests in the region. And Mubarak Egypt is a much bigger country and weightier in international politics. But the population centers of Egypt are fairly distant from Gaza. So it's actually hard for the activists in Cairo to get to Gaza and do things to help them. Although the situation in northern Sinai is also one that's fairly good for the Palestinians of Gaza, and there's this huge tunnel trade that has escalated, especially since Mubarak went. In Jordan, the situation I think is really interesting because there, of course, Jordan is right next to the West Bank, and there is every single Palestinian family in Jordan has relatives in the West Bank, and every single Palestinian in the West Bank has relatives in Jordan. So if there were really a huge growth of a civilian mass movement in Jordan, it would have an instant effect on the West Bank and on Israel's position in the West Bank. The other thing that's really significant now, of course, is what's happening in Syria. And I guess I don't have time because Adel is standing there kind of making... Ominous. Oh, yeah, ominously. So we can discuss Syria later. I just want to conclude by noting that the situation is currently one of extreme dynamism at the internal Palestinian level, at the Arab level, and at the global level. Being at this international conference in Algiers, it was really interesting to hear people's views of how rapidly US power, not just in the Middle East, but globally, has been declining. About three factors. One is the long-term economic decline of the US. Another is the financial crisis of late 2008, and the third factor is what's happened. What is the positions that the US has been taking on Palestinian questions this year. So at a time of such huge dynamism, this is really a time when societies with strong civilian organizations will be the ones that are best able to survive and thrive. And obviously, I hope that the Palestinian community worldwide, despite the fragmentation, will be able to take advantage of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Helena, for a whirlwind tour of the implications, the conditions, and the complications of the way ahead. Dr. Tamari, do you want to follow with your remarks?
Thank you, Skandar. Well, since my friend Helena Cobban has covered everything, maybe I'll take some questions on the floor now. I'll try to find a niche for myself here. This morning, there was a very intriguing essay in the Jerusalem Press by a man called Hani Masri, whose title is, "Can President Abbas Protect Khalid Mishal?" It's not a very innocent question, but it embodies in it all the elements of the predicament of the Palestinians that we face after the President Abbas's speech last week in the UN. One is what future arrangement in the occupied territories, if and when the PA is able to control the territories under its command, and therefore able to give refuge to Khalid Mishal, who is now an impending or about to become a refugee from a collapsing regime in Syria, and therefore the protector of Hamas externally is in deep trouble. What fate for Hamas also, given that one of its central external protectors is no longer in that position, and particularly what is the ability and capability of the Palestinian Authority to conclude a peace agreement or reconciliation agreement with Hamas, and therefore create the unity government that the protesters following the Arab Spring have been fighting for in Palestine. One remark about Helena's comments about the various manifestations of the Arab Spring and how it took different shapes in different countries, depending how much power civil society has. In Palestine, actually, is one of those countries where you do not see the mass demonstrations calling for regime reform, but you did see mass demonstrations calling for reconciliation, because the people both in Gaza and in the West Bank realize that unless they have a minimalist program of facing the future, unless they end up the factionalism that started with the victory of Hamas in the elections and the separation of Gaza from the West Bank, there is no future for any of the components of the Palestinian territories. The question that looms large is, why did the Palestinians go to the UN in the first place? I think it's not difficult to answer this question. First, the Palestinians realized after a prolonged period of negotiations that nothing was coming out of it, and that the Israelis, with American protection, have been using the negotiations as a cover to expand the settlements and the consolidation of their control over the city of Jerusalem, both east and west. And they knew that unless something drastic happens, this process of preemption will continue until any possibilities for disentangling the settlement areas within the West Bank will become impossible. And many people, of course, believe that we have already reached that phase. Second, it was the inability or unwillingness of the Americans to act as mediators in this question, even to the extent of enforcing U.S. conventional positions on Jerusalem and on the settlements. One story is that the last two meetings that Dennis Ross conducted with Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah in September, just before the UN, were so severe and provocative to the Palestinians that one major decision that resolved the issue in his mind was this American attitude, particularly the issue of threatening the Palestinians with cutting aid if the Palestinians persisted in attempting to go to the UN. And finally, the inability of the European Union and the Quartet to create a consensus of European positions on the Arab-Israeli conflict, therefore going along with whatever the Americans have had in their dealings with the Palestinians and the Israelis. But the context of all of this is the shifting regional scene, which Helena discussed, and has been crucial in redefining the parameters of the whole issue, not only what comes after the UN, but the system of alignments in the Middle East, the whole ranking order of protectors and proteges, and the ability of each of the two factions among the Palestinians to depend on external support in their own contestation for power. Another feature of this regional realignment is the interesting but sad manner in which both Fatah and Hamas have become resigned to the division of authority between Gaza and the West Bank. There is a kind of regime separation that made each party not willing either to welcome new elections, which might upset the cart, or have a union agreement which will bring forces of one group to the other in the other region. And therefore, there was this kind of resignation to the division of power, which infuriated the mass movement to the extent that it exists in the occupied territories and within the PLO. There was a feeling that you are now complacent in this kind of division where the successive authority will continue forever, and in the meantime the whole Palestinian territories are being undermined, eaten from within, and there is empty talk going on in the negotiations. The new situation means several things, this new realignment. First, and probably the most important feature, is the rise of Turkey as a major regional power, and the willingness and attempts by Erdogan and the AKP to begin to play a crucial role in first making alliances with Egypt, creating the normal axis of power that had Syria, Iran on the one hand, and Egypt, Saudi Arabia. That whole system has collapsed now with the rebellion that took place. And the emergence of Turkey as one hesitates to say neo-Ottoman power, because that's not a term that the Turks like, and I think some sensationalist journalists like to use it, but it has some kernel of truth. Erdogan, after the Avi Marmara episode with the flotilla, said that we have certain historical responsibilities in this region, and we cannot confine them only to the fact that these are Muslims and Arabs, but they are part of the patrimony, not only of the Ottoman Empire, but of Turkey also, just a few decades ago. And Turkey's economic growing power in the region is now being buttressed by an increasingly political interventionist role that we are bound to hear from it. And we can already see the reverberations in Syria and Iran, in Egypt. And in Palestine, actually, it's very interesting because people expected that Erdogan would play a role of alliance with Hamas. In fact, the opposite has been true, is that Erdogan has been pushing the secular character of the Turkish state as a way of buttressing his alliances with non-religious groups in the Arab regimes. He, as you probably know, he has raised the chagrin of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt when he described Turkey as a secular power and described secularism as an important facet of his own party's relationship to the state. Second, there is the loss of Hamas's base in Syria, which I alluded to earlier, and which will make now the division, internal division between the Gaza-based leadership and the Damascus-based leadership um, an important issue of how the reconciliation process with Hamas, with Fatah, will take place. Fatah also has lost a major ally in Mubarak's Egypt, and the new realities in Egypt are very crucial to the future of Gaza, because the blockade that Mubarak has imposed on Gaza is very unlikely to be continued by the new government, regardless of which coalition of forces come to the fore in Egypt. So that will mean a new opening to Palestine from the southern side that has not been the case before. So, and fourthly, there is the issue of Israel's predicament in an arena where the loss of Mubarak's Egypt and the realignment of Turkey in its vision will impose on Israel major rethinking of its ability to deal with the Palestinians with some kind of a buffer arrangements with neighboring states, Turkey and Egypt in particular. It's a very important development. Where do the Palestinians go from here, which is the title of our panel today? I think the UN vote is likely to drag, and at the moment the quartet is hoping to use this transitional period to propose a negotiating strategy which had failed in the past, but they're trying to re-energize it at the moment by injecting elements of terminality in it. In other words, one feature that the quartet has suggested is that the Israelis and Palestinians will, while the UN vote is being considered, they will go to negotiations with a ceiling, time ceiling, to the efficacy of addressing the three major aspects of final status: the borders, the status of Jerusalem, settlements, and refugees. The four, not three. Now, the problem with that is that the quartet is not able nor willing, apparently, to suggest what will happen if that time ceiling is not met, which is the crucial reason why the Palestinians went to the UN in the first place. Is you can't take us to an uneven negotiations with no protection from the international community, such as we saw in Mozambique, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and indeed in South Africa, without us knowing, one, what the final status is even vaguely look like in terms of borders, and second, if we fail to achieve any kind of modus operandi with the Israelis, what will happen next? Which is really going back to square one. And that is the crucial aspect of the quartet proposal, which Sarkozy is trying in his way to fix. But they're not succeeding in doing that. The alternative to this is that the Palestinians will succumb to negotiations under American fiscal financial pressure and some kind of European enticement that will drag on until the final collapse of the Palestinian Authority comes, because they're unable to deliver and because they would lose their credibility in the minds of the Palestinians. A second option, which has been actually proposed by some leaders within the PLO and by many intellectuals, is to dissolve the Palestinian Authority and ask both the UN and the Israelis to take over. That is, to going back to the status quo which existed before 1993, before the Oslo Agreement. This presumably would allow the Palestinians to enter into resistance mode and would free the legitimacy of the Oslo Agreement as a constraint to the Palestinians making security arrangements with the Israelis and being dependent, as they are today, on international aid through the framework of the Oslo Agreement. I think this is unlikely to happen, although it has a great intellectual appeal, especially here in the US among Arab, Palestinian, and other intellectuals, because it will start with a clean slate. It's unlikely to happen because the Israelis will refuse to take over. It is unlikely to happen, indeed, because it's quite likely that some Palestinian figure will come out and accept to act as a successor to the PA. And this could be, believe it or not, Hamas itself, or one of the warlords that have evolved over the last few years in the West Bank. And this effectively will be some kind of Somalization of the Palestinian problem. A third option is actually to use the mechanisms of the UN, and this is something talked about recently by the people around the Abbas and in the PLO, to enter into long-term negotiations while at the same time fighting for some kind of UN status, mobilizing people around it, taking it to the General Assembly, asking the General Assembly to adopt the Korean example of 1950, creating a peace option if the UN vetoes or fails to deliver statehood, thus bringing an elevated status for the UN in the current negotiation. I think this is part of the Palestinian strategy today, but one which would create a major confrontation with the US and possibly with some of the European allies. The net result from this non-conclusive suggestions of options is that the situation is very fluid. I know this is a concept that Helena mentioned. It's very fluid, very dynamic, and does create new possibilities which a year ago we did not see before, partly as a result of the Arab Spring, but partly also because of the increased, enhanced role of some regional powers like Qatar and Turkey, and the decline of the Saudi and Egyptian role in Arab politics. So, thank you. I will stop here.
But you're in charge.
Oh. The floor is yours. Please address your question to any of the two speakers. Yes, please. No, it's you. Yes.
I have a question maybe either of you could answer. What would you say to the suggestion that the UN statehood bid is extremely problematic for the Palestinians on a whole because of the way in which it would change the representative of the Palestinians from being the PLO to being the Palestinian Authority, which doesn't represent Palestinians outside of the West Bank and Gaza, and perhaps doesn't even represent the Gazan Palestinians, and how the dynamic of the PA taking over the role in the UN would change things.
I know that, like Ali Abu Nimer's argument, one of his many arguments against this, I don't think it explicitly replaces the PLO with the PA. The statehood bid. You know, the PA is a child of a marriage contracted in Oslo between the government of Israel and the PLO. But the PLO is the effective party, and it's the PLO that conducts it's in the name of the PLO that all the negotiations are conducted, even though in this country the media quite frequently just kind of refer to the Palestinian leadership or PA President Mahmoud Abbas. But when they negotiate war and peace, when they negotiate the peace, they do so in the name of the PLO. So I don't think that's a valid argument. There are some reasons to, be wary of this statehood bid. I mean, I don't think it's going to solve anything on its own, but my sense, and I've kind of tried to think this through as much as I can, is that as part of a broader strategy of resistance and liberation, it's a really good move forward. Not least because it's a first step to taking this issue out of the hands of the US monopolists and back to the UN where it rightly belongs. And this is why the changing dynamic of the world order is also really important. I mean, when the quartet was created, it was quite anomalous that you would have a body that is explicitly headed by one member state, the US, that contains amongst its 3 members the UN. I mean, from just like a picture of how the international order ought to work, that's crazy. And then, not to mention you have this highly flawed character, Tony Blair, as the quartet representative, the guy who was the enabler of the invasion of Iraq and should be, brought before a war crimes tribunal, not, given huge amounts of money from various brokerage houses in New York and run the quartet's diplomacy on the side. I mean, the issue is not Tony Blair. The issue is the quartet and how anomalous it is in international affairs that Ban Ki-moon and the whole of the UN bureaucracy have kind of prostrated themselves before American power. That's not going to last. I mean, I do not see the other permanent members as the situation in the Middle East and in Palestine gets worse and worse. I don't see the other permanent members of the Security Council being prepared to go along with this idea that UN legitimacy and the legitimacy of the international system as a whole should be subordinated to US power. And so I think what the Palestinian statehood bid does is it's a first step toward taking the issue back to the UN, which has had it since the day of the UN's birth in 1945. Which is responsible for the partition plan of 1947, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's quintessentially a challenge for the world order. And it's the US relationship with the world that needs to change.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit with what Helena said regarding the diminished standing, both economically and politically, potentially down the road of the United States. I have to disagree with that. Following this arena for the last 30 years, I think we're going through another chapter of talking about these issues, where I think that the one bright spot, quite frankly, is the fact that the Palestinians have gone to the UN. Now, I also think that the U.S. is not going to go away as the power broker here, simply because I cannot identify another one of the quartet or any other group of nations around the world who will step up and do the funding that we in fact do in terms of paying for the Palestinian survival. Who is going to step forward? There's both a political risk and an economic risk for all of them, which I don't think any of them have the courage to take.
On this last issue, actually, the amount of U.S. support for the Palestinian Authority is in the amount of $400 million a year, which is a third of the budget of the Palestinian Authority, and that amount.
Does that include the UN? But the UN piece you're keeping separate, right?
No, it does not include the UN.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm talking about the full package of aid to economic development for the Palestinian Authority. It's not a large amount, even by regional standards, and the Saudis and the Qataris have expressed willingness to replace it. So at that level, I don't think the threat that the Congress made and the State Department, to a lesser extent, of withholding aid is a critical factor. What is critical, and I think you have a point, is that if there's going to be a mediator that is acceptable to the Israelis, an alternative to the Americans is difficult to find, unless you have an enhanced European consensual position in this. But the financial aid itself is not a critical factor.
It's political. The Saudis could have written that check, any number of times in the last 30 years. And they're not going to take the exposure. There's no benefit to them as they see it. And I think when you look at some of the others who could write that check, it's the same thing. What is in it for them to get themselves exposed beyond just I'm not talking about the effect on the Treasury, I'm talking about the effect on their standing and the ability to engage throughout the world. They're going to run up against obstacles which they're not willing to take the chance for, because they've had the opportunity.
The EU has done most of the funding of the PA's institutions. The US funding disproportionately goes toward the security institutions and plays a role in actually keeping those police that are guardians for the settlements, essentially. So that's the unique thing that US funding does. The EU has been funding, the majority of the civilian infrastructure, and there are plenty of people in Europe who say we are fed up with financing the occupation. That's their reluctance to pay. That so long as there's no clear timetable by which this occupation comes to an end. Remember that Oslo had. This goes back to this question that Salim raised of having deadlines. Oslo had a clearly stated and agreed deadline of 5 years, by which time the final status agreement would have been negotiated. The way that it worked out, the way that it's calculated, that 5 years expired in May of 1999, which is 12 years ago. I mean, no, because it was 5 years after the return of Abu Ammar to whatever, so that was May 94, and then so it was 5 years after that. I mean, all this talk of deadlines is worth nothing unless there's a sanction at the end of the day, which is where I think you need to come back to the idea of international law meaning something and the power of the international community. If there's no sanctions for Israel for building the settlements, if there's no sanction for Israel for dragging out the negotiations forever and ever, they will continue to do so. So you can't have a negotiation where a kindergarten child, as Jonathan Koteb says, sits in a room with a sumo wrestler and expect anything sustainable or fair to come out of it. You can't have a negotiation where a kindergarten child sits in a room with a sumo wrestler who has at his side an even bigger sumo wrestler, which is the situation of the United States. So, we have to have the idea that you need a mediator is not the problem. What you need is the international community to come together and say, international law means something, and we intend to pursue it. And it's not a negotiation. It's a negotiation, if anything, only between the international community and Israel on how fast will Israel start complying with international law.
Yeah, but there's never been anybody to step up and begin the negotiation process on that. Because while you're talking about Oslo, Madrid, et cetera, and while you had very liberal labor governments in the Israeli, in power in Israel, you in fact had, as I remember, more settlements being built on the ground than you had during conservative right-wing.
Thank you. Thank you. Please.
Well, I think that the question goes back to a feminist analyst would say, would the masters do dismantle the master's house? I don't know about the international law and the human rights and humanitarian law. There are two elements that are clear, and I think that they were clear in both presentations. What I call in my writing the physics of power, that was reflected in the way you were looking at the U.S. role, the Europeans, the Quartet, the Turkey, and the changes in the area, the Arab countries, and so on, and the chemistry of power, which is what is going on inside among Palestinians. And somehow I felt that we are missed, which is Palestinians in Israel, and our role. And I think that lately we've seen lots of people are coming to the forefront, in different papers and different documents talking about Palestinians' rights and so on. But I do agree with you, Helena, that the question remains the ethical and moral question that is not answered through international law or through any other means unless someone will take the lead in the international community. Internationalizing it by going to the UN is another problem. Is another problem because you're hitting this chemistry of power inside the Palestinian. You're increasing human suffering. You're deleting, you're erasing, you're otherizing, in order to speak truth to power. So it's kind of a catch-22 situation, whereby you kind of wonder, well, would the masters to dismantle the master's house? Should we go to the UN? Maybe that would save who? What about the other place? What about the PLO? What about Palestinians in general? So Palestinians are in Lebanon, but Palestinians are in Haifa with Nasri, and this situation was not solved. So there are so many issues, and looking at Jerusalem as one case study, as just a case study of what goes on in this game between this chemistry of power and physics of power, speaks volume to the fact that there's, it's not about funding, and it's not about US, it's about a clear settler colonial project that unless someone would really step and say we need to stop it, it will never stop. I don't know. I kind of feel so frustrated from where we're standing, mainly because the analysis is always purely political with the workings of power, while the human suffering is kind of forgotten, and the day-to-day mundane abuses that are happening are somehow camouflaged by the need to move the international community. So how do we really go with this? How do we move?
Well, the assumption that you either go to the UN or you resist from the ground, I think need not be exclusive. The people who struggle at the diplomatic front are not the people who go in the streets and fight, or who resist, or who establish civil society. There are several interventions, and in the Arab world this is very popular, this juxtaposition. Instead of fighting for liberation of Palestine, they go and kowtow to the Americans and to the Quartet and to the Europeans. The fact is, the negotiations may be futile, going to the UN may be a waste of time, but it's not an alternative. It's not that, and going to the UN would not stop, in fact may energize the people to go in the streets, to make demands, and even put brakes on the culpability and the tendency among the Palestinian Authority to accept a lower threshold for negotiations. I mean, you are right if that's your point, that saying that the way we discuss things does not take into account what's happening on the ground. In that sense, you're wrong, because we did not discuss civil society, what's happening inside Israel among the Arab population. But I think it's not an exclusive category of negotiation on one hand or fighting for your rights. I don't think that's the option. I don't know if that's what you meant, but all right. Please, yes.
Anyway, I have a few thoughts related to this that I'd like to get your opinion on about the UN. But the one is, I think some benefits from it. One, I think the fact that the Palestinian people were so rejoicing and hopeful that they now have hope for the future. So it seems to me that would make it easier to reduce violence. That people have more to live for, and also that Abbas is a more effective leader. He's a stronger leader now. Before he was more of a weak leader, and I think George Bush didn't, when he came into power, didn't look him a little bit in the eyes of his.
George Bush?
Yeah, that when Abbas came into power.
Yes.
We didn't give him support to look good in the eyes of his people to strengthen him as a leader. I think we didn't help him. And also that in Obama's expected, veto, or people talking about the discomfort with it, that while they're vetoing it, he's sort of bending over backwards to say it's important to have a state, and sort of profuse, trying to be compassionate, and saying we're going to veto it, but we still think they need a state. So I think the rhetoric is changing a little bit. So I think in some different indirect ways, it's shifting the system around. So I wonder what you think about that. And then just one short thing. Johan Galtung has this idea of a six-state solution.
Six-state,
based on the
Six-state.
the Middle East community, the European Union. So I think that sort of maybe helps include the one and the two, but it, or sort of gets out of the dilemma between one or two. So
Can you just explain to us what is the six-state?
Okay, so it's Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt.
Like a Middle East confederation.
Yeah, confederation, and also that with the Israeli Palestinian, you could have cantons in each, and there'd be water and kinds of agreements.
I mean, I think it's true, as far as I can understand it, that Abu Mazen did get some increased popularity from making a great speech at the UN. But, I mean, the Palestinian people have heard some great speeches, many great speeches, including there have been a couple from Obama. People don't need speeches. I mean, they need action. So, as I said, I think that Abu Mazen may actually get sucked into doing more with this UN statehood bid than he had originally intended, just because the logic of the situation may push him forward. That does depend in large part on the continued, really strong pressure he feels from his people. Coming back to this question of the relationship between popular organizing on the ground and people doing diplomacy, at the high level, at the international level, it's quite clear to me that, the diplomats should serve the people rather than the other way around. And what Yasser Arafat tried to do ever since he returned to the West Bank in 1994 was to disarm the people. I mean, not disarm them from arms, but to dismantle the civilian mass organizing networks, the very strong networks that had grown up. Demobilize, thank you, yeah. And to do everything on his own, because he distrusted the people so much. The Hamas leadership is very different. They really place a huge emphasis, and have all along, on organizing the people, organizing women, organizing all sectors of the people, providing services for the people. I mean, it's the traditional way that strong national liberation movements survive and thrive. So they're actually very well positioned, I think, in the current situation of regional fluidity. What's interesting is that they do seem a little torn over how to respond to this statehood bid. Some people are saying, this shows that there's a big division between the Hamas leadership outside and the Hamas leadership inside. I don't think that's the case, because they know very well how to work with each other, and actually it's a lot easier for them now that they have much easier communications through Egypt to come and go. But they have a good leadership that has 6 members in Gaza, 6 members in the West Bank, and 6 members on the outside, and they coordinate very closely with each other. They have differing emphases, and here again it's paradoxical, because people always think Khalid Mashal is the hardliner, and the people inside are the soft ones. It's not the case at all. Khalid Mashal is much softer in his line, including in what he has said about the statehood bid, including what he said in Tehran about the statehood bid, which was fascinating because, you know, the Iranian regime and Khamenei and everybody was railing against Abu Mazen, and Khalid Mashal stood up and said, actually, you know, it's been doing some good. Abu Mazen's been doing some good things, which is very different from what you hear from Haniya and Mahmoud Zahar in Gaza. But that's because they're on the front lines. You know, they can't show the kind of diplomatic flexibility that the external leadership can. Just coming back, since I'm talking about Hamas quickly, to what Salim said about Hamas losing Syria and the big effects that will have. I think it's true that it has something of a short-term logistical effect. It's a challenge, but in the big picture, if you lose Syria and you gain Egypt, you've gained something much bigger. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that the contenders for power in Syria are Ikhwan, a lot of them. And if they do come to power, then it's win-win in essence for Hamas. So, I mean, I don't think I am really concerned about what's happening in Syria for the sake of the Syrian people. I mean, it's just tragic. And today, the State Department spokesman made a statement that was whipping up violence and fear in Syria. And I just think that, you know, what the Syrian people need is to have their very grave internal problems resolved through a serious negotiation. Sadly, nobody's coming forward to do that. But the effects on the Palestinians and on the region will be fascinating and could be explosive. Including today, Assad reportedly made a statement that if anybody threatens to send in external forces into Syria, he will launch missiles against Israel. So I mean, you know, that when we say that the region is fluid and dynamic, there are all kinds of things that could take place. And so the Palestinians being fragmented and scattered amongst all these different political administrations have to be incredibly self-sufficient and clear-minded about what their goals are.
Maybe we should bring you as a consultant. On the second issue that you raised, if I may, it's a very interesting idea, actually. Now I understand what you said about six-state solution. It does create possibilities because, as we know, Bosnia and Croatia became much less hostile to each other after the settlement when they were given special status within the European Union. In other words, the creator of a larger border would make the internal tension less if people have a larger frame of reference. And I think this certainly applies to the Middle East. And in the case of Israel, the problem is, would Israel be willing to join a larger number of states if it's not willing to join the Palestinians in a common or confederated state? It does create possibilities if the balance of power changes. And I think one way of looking at it is to create a customs union or economic union, which probably Turkey is likely to lead in this case. And the presence of the Turks, actually, even if you take into account the recent battles between the Israelis and the Turks, would create wider parameters that allows Israel, one, to become part of the Middle East, second, to diffuse its hostility to the or the antagonism with neighboring state by being part of a larger union. However, and this is very important, however, this is not an alternative to the two-state solution, nor even to the single constitutional state, which I think is a figment of imagination at the moment. but one that is likely to come as a result of historical processes of consolidation and merger in the Middle East in the future. I don't think it's going to happen as an alternative to these arrangements. Yes, please.
Helena, you mentioned before the importance or the lack of a framework wherein international law actually meant something. And I was wondering if both of you could comment on, one, why it has deteriorated so badly over the idealism of 1945 versus, well, and in addition, maybe throw out some ideas about how to make international law mean something regarding the Palestinian situation. Is there any force, anything that you see, either one of you or both of you, that might help to bring this about?
It's for you.
Yes, one of the tragedies of the George W. Bush era was the degree to which Bush openly defied the requirements of international law and derided its importance or its relevance and said, even central pillars of the international order like the Geneva Conventions, that they no longer are needed. He backed away from some of those more extreme positions, but already the damage to the view in this country of international law had been significant. And I think this is largely an issue that Americans need to deal with, because we were a sort of a traumatized people after 9/11 and acted in very self-destructive ways, including in the degree to which we tore holes in the fabric of international law and in the concept of international law. And international law was an American creation. The international order that was created in 1945 was created in San Francisco when the US was at the pinnacle of its power globally. The economies of Europe and Asia had been devastated by war. The US economy accounted for more than half of the world's GDP, and so on and so forth. And yet, at that time of maximal US power, we created this international order of, nation states, four, as it then was, of which would be co-equal, and everybody else would have a formal equality, but four of them would get the veto power. Now, the whole veto system is morally problematic. So, leaping forward to now, it's really anomalous that at a time when our own national power is declining, that there are still so many Americans who don't believe in international law and international order, because we are going to need it as a protection against the overreach of the Chinese and the other powers who are rising in economic and political power globally. So, thus far, the Chinese and the other rising powers have all been fairly much adherents of international law. It has helped them rise, and they appreciate that. So I'm fairly confident, I have some optimism that those powers will continue to want to work within an orderly international system, and hopefully also one that adheres to those original ideals of the UN, that conflicts would no longer be resolved through war, occupation, conflict, and so on. But it's for us here in America, as our country goes down, to be able to explain to our fellow citizens that, look, international law, international order is something that is important for us. And it's important for everybody who realizes the interdependent nature of life on this planet. And, the Palestinians and Israelis are incredibly interdependent. And unless we can, actually help them deal with that fact of interdependence by the application of fair standards of international law that have been written into international law from the get-go. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the International Convention on Refugees, all of those, foundational pillars of international law. Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that any person, any individual has the right either to leave the country she was born in or to return to it. It's the right of return, written into international law. So there are all kinds of things. Of course, the Campaign for Soviet Jewry was very eager to use that portion of the Universal Declaration that says that any person has the right to leave the country of their birth, but they didn't go on and read the second half of that. I'm modestly optimistic that as our fellow Americans come to understand more about, our fragile position on God's earth, that we will realize, George W. Bush was wrong to shred international law, and the basic principles of fairness and human equality are important ones.
And we'll have one more intervention if there's one. Otherwise, I just want to make a final remark to Helena's remark. I think Helena has a very keen observing eye of what's happening in the occupied territories in the Middle East, but she does tend to have a romantic view of Hamas that I do not entirely share, both in terms of their efficiency and in terms of democratic practices. If there's one word we can distinguish between the West Bank and Gaza, and the situation can be worse, of course, and you described very important features of the way Hamas runs Gaza that people do not realize, and Yazid Sayegh also contributed. But I think it tends to be a police state, much more than you think. And I would say if I have a choice between living in a corrupt state like the one run by Mahmoud Abbas or a police state in Gaza, I will choose a corrupt one to live in. But that's my personal choice. Well, thank you very much for your presence, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.